Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for The Neutral Zone, which is episode 26 of season 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. This video is a part of a series of videos where I cover every episode of Star Trek Next Generation. One episode at a time. In this video I cover the season 1 finale, The Neutral Zone. So The Neutral Zone is the episode where Picard is on a mission to discover why some Federation outposts had been destroyed near the Neutral Zone. At the same time, Data discovers some people frozen in space from the 20th century. He thaws them and they have to readjust to life in the 24th century. And when the Enterprise finally meets up with the Romulans, they discover that the Romulans had their own outposts destroyed as well, so they agree to a tentative alliance. So, this is something, I guess I'll start with this, even though this is something I just learned about. I wasn't really that aware of it through the decades of watching this episode, but this script for this episode was in fact a first draft. And I'll be honest, I think there's other episodes that feels more like a first or second draft, and I think I've talked about that in my reviews before, where it feels like the script was not tightened up a bit and it needed more work. I never really got that impression from this episode. In fact, I would probably say that this is one of the better episodes of season 1. And of course, that's not saying a lot, seeing how not good season 1 is overall. But this is one of the episodes that I have my least complaints. I think there are way worse episodes in season 1, more episodes that feel like a first draft. But this was due to the writer's strike that happened in 1988, because apparently the strike began while this episode was being produced, and so they all they had was the first draft, and they weren't allowed to do any more work on it. So honestly, I feel like this is what they would have done now, because as I'm recording this, there was just recently a writer's strike, and they talked about shutting down production even for scripts that were fully written, because they wouldn't be able to have a writer on set in order to make last-minute adjustments, so they just shut down production. So it seems like that would have been wiser than continuing to film an episode with only a first draft. That being said, as I said, the final product was actually not as terrible, but the director did talk a lot about how some things, just didn't work, or, and how this episode didn't come together that well, mainly because of the script. And it's funny because they also said that when this episode first came out, it was one of the least favorite episodes of season 1, which I'm, again, surprised, because I actually think there are much, much, much worse episodes of season 1, and I think that has probably changed in retrospect. Now, to me, the obvious flaw with this episode is it's called The Neutral Zone, and it starts the episode planting itself about, oh my god, there's this huge Romulan threat. But the Romulan threat of the Neutral Zone is really, I would say, definitely the B plot. And it actually takes up very little screen time, and it's not really a full story. There's not really resolved. They just Picard thinks the Romulans destroyed some of their outposts, and they go to investigate, and they find out the Romulans didn't destroy their outposts. There was some unknown third party, which I'll get to that later. And they agreed to sort of a tentative alliance, but then the Romulans, before they leave, said, we've been leaving you alone, leaving the Federation alone, but that's gone now, we're back. Dun dun dun. And that's not really a story. The story of this episode, the A plot, was the plot with the humans from the 20th century being awakened, which is actually a story I really liked. I do agree that this maybe could have benefited from more drafts of the script, but it actually really works for me in several ways. So, alright. Let me first, before I get to those humans of the 20th century, but I do have a lot to say about it, let me first stick with the Romulans. Because the Romulans were mentioned in the episode Angel 1, and they were talking about how it was a side plot. It was just an excuse of why the Enterprise needs to be somewhere very fast, and they have to hurry up and resolve the situation in Angel 1 is because there's Romulans are attacking outposts, and the Enterprise needs to show up to help defend it. And then in this episode, they said that the Federation and Starfleet had zero encounter with the Romulans for over 50 years. And so this is something I noticed, when I used to go back and watch these episodes over and over again. It's like, wait a second, how are they saying that they had no encounter with the Romulans when there was this episode just earlier this season where they clearly encountered the Romulans? And the reason for that is, and I think that's something I discussed in my review of Angel 1, is that and this is something I only learned about recently as well, but in the original script for Angel 1, it was Ferengi, but at this point, they had decided that the Ferengi absolutely weren't working as a villain and decided to nix them, so they basically did like a copy and paste thing and went in the script and changed all reference. Hey, get off my computer. Sorry. They changed all references to the Ferengi to Romulans. So I guess that explains that, but it's still a continuity error on why they would say we hadn't had contact with the Romulans. Now they mentioned the Tomid incident in this episode, and there later was actually a Star Trek novel written about this. I didn't read the book myself. I'm kind of curious now of what it might be, and I think it was linked to the Treaty of Alderaan, which was mentioned in the episode Pegasus all the way over in season 7 of TNG. So a lot of people sort of tie a lot of history to that, and I think it would be interesting to learn more about that history and why the Romulans sort of, decided to disappear. But I find that the end of the episode and where we get Mark Alamo playing a Romulan is so weird because now I can only see Gul Dukat, especially when he talks. Like, I just hear Gul Dukat, and I'm like, that's not a Romulan, that's a Cardassian, it's Gul Dukat. It's so hard for me not to see that as Gul Dukat, and because he plays the character almost exactly like Gul Dukat as well. It's not just that it's the same actor, he's using the same voice inflections and the same manner of speaking and the way he presents himself. I'm like, it's Gul Dukat. But anyway, I find the moment where, they were talking at first, with Picard about the outpost being destroyed, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, do you get our meaning? We're back. And then they decloak and disappear, and like, dun 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 dun. To me, that felt like a very contrived writing moment that there was, and again, this is probably first draft showing, but that felt very clearly like the showrunner saying, hey, we're bringing back the Romulans, yeah, we get it. I mean, it was just, we don't really need that. We don't need a writer screaming or a showrunner or producer or whatever screaming in the audience's ears saying, hey, the Romulans are going to be the big bads from now on. Don't worry about those stupid Ferengi. It was a contrived, really sort of moment that really knocked you out of the universe of the story. I never really liked that. I always thought that was very cheesy. Alright, so now let me get to the part about the outpost being destroyed. Now, if you listen to the way it's described how these outposts were destroyed, that it was as if some force scooped the entire thing up, and it seemed like, technology. And the Romulans described that they knew it was technology that was far beyond the capability of Starfleet, which is funny because... which is funny. And yes, I know you want attention. Which is funny because the Starfleet didn't think that it was beyond the capability of the Romulans. They were assuming maybe the Romulans had that capability, so it really shows maybe the Romulans were maybe able to do a more thorough investigation, or maybe the Romulans know more about Starfleet than Starfleet knows about the Romulans. I know. Anyway, so yeah, God, I got distracted. So, but this was originally intended to be the Borg, and if it wasn't for said writer's strike, this would have been part 1 of a 3-parter that would have been continued on in season 2, that would see Starfleet teaming up with the Romulans to take on the Borg. Now, seeing as the episode has the final product of what it ended up being, I don't think a 3-parter like that would work. Even though it does sound like an interesting concept and something that I think could have been explored really well, especially if you transplant it to later seasons of TNG, you got to think of it in the context of season 1 and early season 2 of TNG, which were not good and still cheesy, and particularly in the context of this episode that was mostly about these humans from the 20th century, and a Romulan's aspect of it was kind of just an afterthought, that if they had 2 episodes carrying on from this storyline, I think the foundation was too weak. And maybe that would have changed if there wasn't a writer's strike, but still, I feel like this would be a bad first part for a 3-parter, and especially since most of the episode doesn't even deal with the Romulan aspect of it. And also, I wouldn't trust the writers of early season 2 to do that storyline justice, to Maurice Hurley and people involved. Now, some people might argue that Maurice Hurley and the other writers of season 2 did do a good job once they finally did introduce the Borg and Q-Who, but I would argue against that because I think that episode is incredibly overrated, but I covered that in another video. But regardless of that, it was still late season 2 or later season 2 where the writing staff was a little bit different than in late season 1, early season 2, and I still feel like a story with the Romulans teaming up with Starfleet to take on the Borg would have been more grandiose than what they did in Q-Who. But honestly, I think I love the concept of that way better than the concept of Q flinging the Enterprise over to the other side of the galaxy and then meeting the Borg. I, again, stated repeatedly in my reviews of Q-Who that's my major issue with that episode, is the Q element, which I did not buy. So I think an element of the Borg show up and start destroying outposts around the neutral zone and forcing Starfleet to work with the Romulans would be a much better way to introduce the Borg, in my humble opinion. Now, there are cases in canon to show that this was actually the Borg, particularly when you get to Voyager and you see that there were Romulans assimilated by the Borg. But for me, and this is something that a lot of later incarnations of Star Trek do, Voyager's very guilty of it, and the Picard and other shows, Prodigy, or I don't know, a lot of other shows will have a lot of known species, Federation, Alpha Quadrant, or races that we've seen on Star Trek before be assimilated by the Borg, but that actually doesn't make any sense because the Borg didn't really go into the Alpha Quadrant that much, and when they did, their ships were destroyed. So how the fuck did these people get back to Borg space? And don't give me crap about transwarp hubs or transwarp condors or any bull BS like that, because that is all contrived nonsense that actually doesn't work anyway. And why would they take the time in the middle of invading Earth to send drones away back to the Delta Quadrant? That doesn't make any sense. And this particularly comes up in the Voyager episode where this person specifically said they were assimilated at Wolf 5359. Then why didn't you fucking die when the cube was destroyed then? But anyway, I'm getting way off topic. Going on a tangent now. Point is, yes, you could say that the Romulans showing up as born droids later is, sort of supports that this was the Borg that attacked the neutral zone here. But really is probably not actually proof of that. It's just more proof that these later shows just are very unimaginative and love to reintroduce Alpha Quadrant species who have no business being assimilated by the Borg to be Borg. And that's all I'll say about that. And because it's never explicitly stated that this was the Borg, even though that was the original intention. I don't know if this was still when they conceived the Borg to be insectoids. Apparently that was the original conception of the Borg, but they realized doing so would be way too expensive, so they changed it to cyborgs. And I don't know if that change was made before or after the writing of this episode. But yes, the whole thing of scooping up the colonies was exactly as we've seen in Q-Who and Best of Both Worlds, but then of course that became abandoned later on when the Borg sort of morphed from stealing technology to wanting to assimilate cultures and people into their collective, which is, again, another topic entirely. I think I've seen some B-can. In fact, I think I remember reading a novel a long time ago, but I only have a vague impression, so I can't tell you exactly what happened. But somehow they tried to explain what happened in the neutral zone. They tried to tie it in and finally tie up this episode, but I think it was a Borg cube who traveled back in time or some bullshit, or I don't know. I don't remember. But it would have been interesting had they actually explained this, because in canon itself, this actually doesn't make any sense, because this was before, the Borg encountered Starfleet or even heard of them, and they shouldn't be anywhere near the Alpha Quadrant, and why would they just destroy a few outposts in the neutral zone and just disappear? Doesn't make any sense unless you go like that novel where Borg cube traveled back in time and destroyed some outposts, but then traveled back to where it came from. Which is, it's a very thin way to tie up. So really, this episode hangs as a retconned episode that doesn't really fit into canon, or at least this aspect of it, unless you say it's not the Borg. But then again, who the fuck was it then? It hangs as its own retconned thing because of the writer's strike, because they weren't able to do what they originally intended to do. And and this is mainly Maurice Hurley's idea. I think this is around the time he was first becoming the showrunner, and he wanted to sort of prove himself in the Borg, which I think was originally conceptualized by Roddenberry himself, and I talk a lot more about this in Q-Who. Maurice Hurley was definitely a champion of them, and I think this was his way of starting to slip them in, but then because of the writer's strike, they had to abandon this idea until Q-Who. Anyway, let's talk about the 20th century people. Now, for me, I think this episode is the clearest example of Roddenberry preaching his moneyless society idea of the Federation. And this is a concept that a lot of writers later on in Star Trek did not understand. There were specific writers who were very influential in later Star Trek, such as Ronald D. Moore, and I think even Brenna Brega, who, especially Ronald D. Moore, who went on the record saying that they completely didn't understand this and disagreed with this concept. But I actually, for my own philosophy, I totally agree with. In fact, this was one of the aspects of Roddenberry's vision of the future, because some of his other stuff, like, oh, there would be no lawyers in the 24th century, and people don't grieve in the 24th century, and people don't argue with each other in the 24th century, that's all bullshit that I wouldn't buy. But his actually concept of a moneyless future is something I totally, absolutely do buy. In fact, I do believe that in order for the Federation to be this peaceful paradise that's it's presented to be, at least Earth being, eliminating poverty, eliminating crime, conflict, and it's all peaceful haven, I think you need to eliminate money as it exists now. Now, that is not to say that there is no economy, because there must be some economy, and I've read some things about, some people wrote novels or did YouTube videos trying to sort of justify how they, allocate resources and how they do trade with other cultures if they don't have money. But I'm sure there's a system to do that. But because this episode is the main episode, I don't know if it's the first one. I think it may be the first one, because there are earlier episodes of particularly the original series where it is implied people use money. Like, I remember Kirk telling Scotty, you just earned your pay for the week. Which I remember watching that episode after I've seen this episode and other episodes of TNG, and I was like, what do you mean paid? They don't get paid. Which is what What's-Her-Face said in First Contact. You mean you don't get paid? But anyway, yeah, so I'm totally on board with this concept, but in this episode, which is the main episode that does tackle it, it just presents it as a sort of vague idea. And that is the problem with a lot of Roddenberry's vision of the 24th century, is that he just presents it as like sort of vague ideas and doesn't get into any specifics, which is why I think a lot of people have a hard time swallowing it and attack it. But I think, and I'm not the one to get into specifics about it, but I have seen, just leaving Star Trek aside entirely, I have seen conceptual ideas of how a society, especially based on advanced technology, in which people didn't have to do menial jobs and tasks, and that could be done mostly by technology, how that society could be based around a model that was not focused on profit, that people did not need to earn money in order to live, in order to have shelter or food or basic health care or even luxuries or other things, that these things could be allocated in different ways other than simply forcing people to work, clean toilets and flip burgers and work jobs that actually don't really need to exist and hurt the environment. And that there would be better ways to allocate resources. And again, I'm not going to go into details of that, but there does exist more specific ideals and models out there that I think absolutely could work, especially in a 24th century setting with technology as advanced as this. So it's definitely hard to see it in contemporary, especially to see the transition because we're so far away from doing anything like that. And of course, a lot of modern people would dismiss it as communist and whatnot, but it's definitely a lot more complicated than that and bears almost no resemblance to the Soviet Union style communism. That's just a way to attack ideals people don't understand or like. But of course, a lot of people have referred to it as a socialist utopia, and that I think is actually very accurate. In fact, it was put into canon recently when in Strange New Worlds, when it had the character of Pella specifically called it a socialist utopia. So, which is a lot of how it's described in this episode. So actually, this is one of the reasons why I like this episode a lot, is because it focuses a lot on these ideals, and it's something that I loved about Star Trek, something I actually agree, one of my favorite parts of Roddenberry's vision of the future. And it's also why there's some modern incarnations of Star Trek, a lot of people complain, oh, this doesn't have the feel of Star Trek, but I'm more willing to go with it. But when they go against this idea of having a moneyless society, that really bothers me. But I'm particularly thinking of the Picard show season 1. And stuff like that just seems to attack the very ideals. That bothers me a lot, because it's not because, it messes with canon. No, it's because I love this about Star Trek. This is one of my favorite things about Star Trek. And I didn't like how some of the writers of Deep Space Nine and Voyager, particularly Deep Space Nine, didn't understand this and sometimes even mocked it. Because this is something I absolutely personally agree with, and I do believe if there ever is to be a utopian society that is this well advanced and eliminated poverty, want, and hunger, it would have to be a totally different society economically that was not based on profit and money. And as I said, there's other ways they could explain economic trade and stuff like that. It's just, I think it's so outside of what modern day sees as the function of those, is that they're just unwilling to even imagine such a process and just dismiss it out of hand without considering its possibilities. And how in ancient societies that were a bit more primitive did something similar. Like this whole economy thing, the way it's been enacted for the past 1,000 years was mainly came about with the advent of agriculture. But anyway, that's, again, I'm getting way off topic. So getting back to this episode specifically, I do love how they have the character of Oppenhaus, I think his name is, who is all, it's kind of a parody of himself, but this is actually something I think really works for me, how he's just like, oh, what about my stocks? Let me make a telephone call to my lawyer. and Picard and Mercury are like, you do know it's like 400 years later, right? And he's like, well, yeah, of course, but that was my lawyer was a very prominent figure in a prominent firm, so rest assured that firm is still around. I would have been loved to find out if the firm actually was still around. I kind of doubt it, but regardless, especially if they handled like stocks and shit with the parent, which definitely is not something that exists in the 4th century. But yeah, no, I love the interaction with Oppenhaus and how Picard. Some of Picard's speeches, and I think some people really don't like them, and how he really goes after his, desire for things and possessions, And I actually love that. And when Alpenhouse's retort to that is, it's not about possessions, it's about power. And Picard's like, power to do what? It's like to control your life. And Picard's like, well, that kind of power is an illusion. Fucking A, Picard. I totally agree with him. And also, I think Oppenheimer is kind of lying to himself or misrepresenting what he really wants. It's not really about power over your own life, especially when you're talking about, the top 1% and who he was clearly very well off. It's not about power to control your own life. It was about power to control other people, to control everything around you, including other people's societies and everything, to have complete control. They're really control freaks, and that's what it's about. And absolutely, in order to have a utopian, futuristic society, that is definitely something, an idea that needed to be completely scrapped and abandoned and seen as primitive. So when Picard mocks, when he's talking to like Troy or Riker, and he mocks them as being, how did we ever just survive the 20th century, and how primitive are these motherfuckers? I completely agree. And I think a lot of people, again, modern audiences have a hard time swallowing this, because they're really laying it thick, because they're really like, we live in the late 20th century, or at least they did around early 21st now. But when this episode came out, it was the late 20th century. And we live in that. And so this episode's saying that we're primitive, that we suck. Well, fuck you, episode. And I understand that reaction, but this, and why some people would reject it like that. But I think it's actually makes it even more brave and notable to point out to people what the current flaws of our society are, and how, in more abstract rather than specific terms, that the model, and most people don't look at the big picture function of societies in modern times. They get too sort of bogged down in specific details, and how the whole modeling your whole sort of life off of the possession of things in order to get power is probably not the best way to run a society. And I love how Picard openly mocks them about that. And what are you doing? Anyway, God, these cats are crazy. So get off my computer. Anyway, so one thing I will say, though, that I've heard people complain about this episode that I actually agree with, is that Picard is being really callous, and Riker, when Data wants to revive these people. And a lot of people point out that Data, they find his relic, they just happen to find his relic floating around by accident, which, again, it's hard to believe because space is vast. But anyway, and Data wants to go explore, and Riker's just like, well, why the hell do you want to do this? We're in a hurry. Come on, Data. Fuck off with this bullshit. Alright, well, I guess you can do it, Data, if you want to be dumb. When Starfleet's whole mission, and especially the Enterprise's whole mission, is to explore, and they should be fascinated by relics of the past, a chance to study history. So his attitude here is very antithetical to the very point of Starfleet, and this is a complaint I've heard, and I totally agree with this. And again, this is probably a result of the whole first draft thing. But when they went aboard the ship and started reviving the people, did remind me a lot of Space Seed. Although instead of being, evil supermen, they were just like regular people who were dying and wanted to save themselves. And I could also make some jokes about Futurama head things, but I never liked that aspect of Futurama. That's one of the things I thought really dumb, especially when they had the Nixon head become president. That was, stupid. But anyway, getting off topic again. So, Yeah, the whole attitude that they had, especially when Picard seemed really pissy at Data because he brought the people back to life, and it was like, Data, why didn't you just leave them there to die? And Data's like, well, it seemed like the right thing to do, and Picard's like, but Data, they were already dead. Fuck you, Picard, you're being a dick. Like, this is something a lot of people pointed out, and I totally agree with them. Like, yeah, technically they were dead, but they could be saved, which they clearly were, and they were revived, and they're alive now, so your argument is invalid, and go fuck yourself, Picard. Like, yeah, so this is bad writing. This is probably, again, a result of a first draft, that Picard was being such a dick, and that they were all being dicks to Data, and Data seems to be the only one with a heart, and he's an android. He's the only one who's not like a callous motherfucker who just wants to leave people to fucking die and float in space forever. Like, what the actual? Come on. Like, I get those complaints. They totally make sense to me, and again, I think it is a result of the first draft. And then you have the scene where one of the woman first wakes up. I can't remember her name, but she first wakes up and she sees Worf and faints, and they play this like corny, like cheesy sitcom music, or a dun 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 dun. Oh, you see that? It reminds me of those stupid like endings that they used to have for the original series when they would make a stupid joke and have Kirk and Spock and McCoy in the bridge going, which I fucking hated those. And this is what it reminded me of, and I hated it too. It was so dumb. But I kind of liked the character of Sonny. And I did think his interactions with Data was pretty funny, and especially when he would, like, you know, say slang in when he was like, I just figured it was a bunch of hooey, and Data's like, inquiry, hooey. Like, he even said it with like a southern accent. And later he said something really crazy that I had no idea what he was talking about finding some. I can't even remember what he said. And Data asked Riker, is like, what does that mean? Riker's like, I don't know, you got me. And I'm like, I got me as well. I had no idea. But, you know, the fact that he got a guitar and he just wanted to sit back and relax, and he didn't really care, and he was adjusting to life a lot easier because he was just going with the flow. Like, I like this. I think this is one of the better written characters. The Oppenhaus guy, if that was his name, the broker guy, he maybe was being a bit too ridiculous by like storming on the bridge and whatnot and interrupting a Romulan meeting. And why did the security, like, Picard ordered the security men to take him off the bridge, yet they just sat there and waited until Picard finished having his conversation with the Romulans and then took him off the bridge. I don't know why he did that, but it was a nice moment when Oppenhaus sort of interrupted when the Romulans were sort of talking and pointed out the fact that the Romulans don't know who destroyed the outpost, and that they're just trying to see if the Enterprise knows, but they're too arrogant to admit that they don't know. And Picard, it was at least smart enough to recognize. Like, Riker was like, you're out of line, but Picard was smart enough to recognize. It's like, yes, he is, but he's also correct. And it shows Oppenhaus's actually does have some ability, and he does have something to benefit in 21st century, and I actually think this should have been explored more. And I know there was a novel written in the 90s where Oppenhaus became a Federation ambassador, and it was about them dealing with a dispute with the Ferengi over the planet, which to me sounded like a really interesting concept, because the Ferengi are just like, he was all obsessed with money and everything, and it seemed like that would be the perfect like ambassador to deal with them. But I tried reading the novel several times, and I didn't really like it. I didn't get through the whole thing. I kept, every time I tried, I'm like, this is boring or stupid. There's something about, I can't remember, it was a long time ago, but something about it didn't interest me or didn't make sense, and it wasn't as good as I thought the concept would be, so I never actually finished the novel. But it sounds... it was interesting to learn of whatever became of him. And that kind of future for him to become a negotiator, an ambassador, actually makes perfect sense. Especially where we see here that he's able to read the Romulans the way he is. But then there's the other character, the woman who, again, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name. But she, it was kind of interesting too from her perspective of not having agreed to this, having her husband do this for her, and finding herself in the, waking up 300 years later, and all the sons that she was raising and her whole family have been dead for centuries, and her having to cope with that, and how Troy's sort of work. I think this is better Troy moments where she actually acts like a freaking counselor, where she does make her feel better and helps her find her ancestors well, not ancestors, sorry, descendants. She's the ancestor. Her descendants, and that they're still on Earth, and that she's going to go back and be reunited with them. And at first she thought, well, that was weird. Like, how could I do this and speak, to someone who is, I'm the great grandmother. I just feel like a relic out of place. And Troy's like, but no, they're your family. And she looks at the pictures like, yeah, there's no denying that. So first of all, she says that the picture is a spitting image of her husband. This is Star Trek logic for you. A descendant who is like many generations down the line is not going to look exactly like her husband. Like, it's just not going to happen. That's stupid. But I wish, this is another thing I wish we got follow-up on. I would have liked to see what happened when she did reunite with her family, and how they would have... In fact, I wish they would have had her call them. Like, so they can include this episode again. Maybe if we had more drafts of the script, include a scene where she actually called them, and they're like, oh my god, it's so great, we can't wait for you to get to Earth, and maybe reminisce or whatever, and just have that ease of interaction. I think that would have been the conclusion that would have really made the storyline a lot better. But anywho. So that's pretty much all I have to say about this episode. This whole storyline with the people from the 20th century could have been done better, especially with the callous way that Picard and Riker were mentioning them. Like, God, what barbarians! But on the other hand, like, I did like how primitive they did seem to the 21st century. Like, that rang true to me. Like, I actually buy sci-fi less that's taking place, 400, 500 years in the future, where people act exactly as they act now, and if someone from the 20th century went to visit them, they would fit right in place. Unfortunately, a bit of modern Star Trek is like that a little bit, but I buy that a lot less, because you think of someone from 400 years ago coming to modern society now, they would be completely out of place. Their ideals would seem really primitive and disgusting, and they would seem barbaric in comparison, and so it makes complete sense that this is how the Enterprise crew would react to them. And I think it's actually very clever to sort of shine a light on our present day flaws by doing so. But anyway, I want to thank those that support me on Patreon, as very much appreciated. It does help this channel to keep going. It helps me to keep doing this channel. I very much appreciate it. I'm very humbled and by your support. So just a quick shout out to Greg Marley, Francisco, Chuck Hooks, Kyrie091, Anthony D. Benedictus, Ricky Manijester, Joel Valls, Alessandro Migalicio, Norman Buckwald, Stephen Kennedy, Britton Berg, Allison Fordyce, and Brandon Neal Howells. Thank you all so very, very much for your support. So we do have a few comments from the Patreon supporters on this episode. First comment is from Norman Buckwald that says, "The neutral zone is a clumsy script that especially does not handle the Romulan visit well. Granted, this was always going to pale to Balance of Terror, and I don't quite remember, but maybe by this episode the writer's strike had existed. So as provocative as it was to end a season with 'We are back' as a forthright enemy for the TNG era at the end of season 1, it's more of a statement at the end to rather a mostly bland episode where the A story is not about the neutral zone but our 20th century out of the icebox humans, and here, well, the arrogance and haughtiness and superiority of the TNG crew, especially Picard, makes Roddenberry's vision seem heartless, while these three members, well, they were fine, but I doubt many fans were demanding some type of follow-up of any of these characters that happened to come from their own era. Most notably is an explanation to our 1% financier how things now work and function in the 24th century, which actually was handled well without, in that case, any haughtiness compared to the other parts of the episode. Otherwise, this episode is just average, and I give it 5 blocks of iced humans out of 10, with no one noteworthy like Amelia Earhart. Don't even get me started on that whole Amelia Earhart Voyager episode. Jeez. And I kind of like how they were just normal people and nothing, sort of noteworthy about them. But yes, Norman's sort of touching on what I touched on more about how heartless Picard and Riker seemed to be about. Oh, why you just let them die? That is a very notable flaw of this episode. So, next comment is from Greg Marley, who says, "It's too bad the 1988 writer's strike ruined what was intended here, but I've always liked this episode. The Romulan encounter plot line generates a decent sense of danger and mystery, and the cryogenic story gives us a fun chance to see 20th century figures who are really us, the audience, interacting with the crew. I think they're a good enough representation of different real-life personality types displaying different coping mechanisms when waking up in the distant future. It always seems odd how little interest Riker shows in Data's discovery of the frozen people. Oh, just get them and get on the ship. And amusing how Picard didn't even know they'd been beamed on and unfrozen. What doesn't work, though, is Picard's initial reaction that they should have been left there since they were already dead. No, by definition, they're not dead, and since when has Picard, the historian, been uninterested in helping people they come across and making contact with them, especially when they're people from 20th century Earth? I can only guess this is a result of how they wrote Picard in Season 1 to often be gruff and grumbling. Note the TOSE play at humor when the woman wakes up and sees Worf and then passes out again, complete with the whimsical music sting right out of a second season episode ending. The original series production and personnel were strong in this first year. Yes, I totally agree with that. That was really cheesy. But yeah, it is interesting point that Greg brings up, because try to imagine how fifth season Picard would handle this situation if they came across a ship from 20th century Earth that contained people who were frozen and were still could be brought back to life. He would have been fascinated by this. He would have been like, wow, what a great chance to look at history and our past. And also he would, want to save their lives and not be like, well, just leave them there. They're already dead. Like, it does. I think it's more than just the fact that the way they did write Picard more gruff in season 1. That's absolutely true. But I also think it's a result of this is a first draft. And I think written by Maurice Hurley after he first came on the show, so he didn't really understand what TNG was about or what Picard's character was like. Because, yeah, in later seasons, you absolutely cannot picture Picard acting this way. Anyway, next comment is from Ricky, who says, this episode was fine. Nothing special. I did find both storylines mildly interesting. Like, I enjoyed the 3 frozen people waking up in the 23rd century and getting used to the new timeline. Correction, 24th century. But anyway, I also like the Romulan part of it as well, even though it was short. What I find the most interesting is that in the behind the scenes, that this was supposed to be the introduction to the Borg, but not like the ones we are familiar with, but more of an insectoid design. It makes me wonder what would have happened had there not been a writer's strike at the time. Overall, an okay episode, so my rating is a 6 out of 10. Indeed. So, final comment is from Alessandro Michelaccio, who says, I never understood why Picard treats the frozen people found by Data so much as a nuisance. Like, don't bother me with this exceptional archaeological find. I got to get to patrol the neutral zone. Yeah, no, that is an excellent point. Yeah, I didn't even mention the fact that Picard, well, of course, this episode was written before they introduced his interest in archaeology, but still, especially with his interest in archaeology, he would be fascinated to find, like, not only this ship, but living people from a time of 400 years ago. He would be so interested to learn, and he would probably like get an historian who's on board the Enterprise to like help him and talk to them, and he would like be really sort of kind to them and be like, oh God, we found you and this is what life in the 24th century, more understanding than this, oh, get these fucking people away from me, I have to deal with the Romulans. Like, that was, yeah, not a very good portrayal of Picard. So, my rating for the neutral zone, out of 10. I think I'm being really generous, but I feel like I always give this episode this rating, even though it is incredibly generous. I'm going to give this an 8, extremely good. Now, granted, it's a low 8, and now if I did 0.5, so it would probably be a 7.5, but again, I don't. And I think this episode skews more towards an 8 than a 7, just slightly. And that's mainly because of the 20th century storyline. Even though there are some missteps, as we talked about thoroughly in this video about the asshole-ish way that Picard and Riker react to them, but I do like the contrast of having modern day people and in this futuristic utopia, and sort of showing the contrast between how these societies operate and how our society that we view as normal could be viewed as primitive and destructive when looked at a more developed society. And again, I agree a lot. And I love the Roddenberry vision of a moneyless future, and I do agree this is absolutely the direction humanity needs to go in order to survive, in order to create a better society, and need to move beyond our petty obsession with possessions and power. So I like that. And again, that's one of my favorite aspects of Star Trek. It's one of the things I like most about Star Trek, and this episode sort of represents to me that ideal more than any other episode. So that is why I am being so generous and giving it an 8, which is, very generous, but especially considering, the Ash Hollis Wade Picard and Riker act at the start of the episode and how rushed and incomplete the Romulan storyline felt. But hey, it's also cool seeing Gul Dukat as a Romulan. So that is it for my review of The Neutral Zone. So just checking out, I don't know, don't ask me why I said it like that, but anyway, seeing what's coming up on my channel next Monday. I'm gonna start a new thing, which I haven't done yet, but it's gonna become a tradition on this channel, and so that is going to be, I'm going to do a video ranking all of the episodes of Season 1 of Star Trek Next Generation from my least favorite to my favorite. And from now on, I will be doing this at the end of every season that I cover. So every time I finish covering a season, I will do a video where I rank all of the episodes. Now, granted, I didn't do this for the original series, but yeah, that's just it's gonna have to miss out on that, because I will be doing it going forward for Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise. Every time I finish a season, I'm gonna look back and rank all the episodes because I haven't actually done this before. Within a season, usually I just rank the entire show or whatever, and by that point it's too many episodes. I do like top 25s or bottom 10s or whatever. But I think it'll be interesting to look back on each season as I cover them. So that is what will be coming up on Monday. And on Wednesday, we'll be releasing a video I did a couple months ago for my patrons, Top 10 Star Trek Actors Revisited. I did a video 5 or 6 years ago, almost 7 years ago, about my top 10 favorite Star Trek actors, and I did revise that list a bit, got into details about some of the background and the reaction to that video, which is my most popular Star Trek video on my channel, and sort of revised my top 10, which we'll be releasing publicly this Wednesday on my channel. And then Thursday we'll cover the next episode of Lower Decks, and then Saturday I'm going to do something a bit out of the box. Going to do my top 10 episodes of The Expanse. Now, it has been a long time since I've covered The Expanse on my channel. I have been sort of eager to get back to getting into The Expanse a little bit, and I realized, it just occurred to me that I never did a top 10 episodes video. I did a ranking all episodes of The Expanse, which was a video that was like over 3 hours long, and so not really accessible to people who just want something short. So I'm going to try to make it short. I'm going to try to make it like less than 10 minutes, so it's going to end up being 20 minutes, because that's what always happens when I try to make a short video. But at least it will be a shorter version that's not 3.5 hours long, that just focuses on my 10 favorite episodes of one of my favorite shows of all time. That, again, I still love this show. My cats are named Naomi and Holden. I don't know if most people know that. And so I don't cover it as much on my channel because it's not much to talk about it anymore, and not much of demand, if I'm being honest. More people are interested in my Star Trek videos. But yeah, I would like to get back to that. So I'll be doing top 10 episodes of The Expanse. So that's what's coming up on my channel. Be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.